Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Justice in 100% Clean Energy Policies, a Scorecard for Equity and Lessons from Washington State. We have some excellent guest speakers with us today, and before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees today are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, hopefully, but we can't hear you. You've got a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled on your screen. You can also use that arrow to expand your webinar console. And one of the things you might like to do with that is to submit questions via the questions box. And we will save some time following our presentations for a Q&A with the audience. We're going to get to as many questions as we can. We do have a lot of people registered for this webinar, so I expect a lot of questions. Type yours in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email probably this afternoon, tomorrow at the latest, with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of all of the slides. And we'll also post those webinar materials on our website, cesa.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know because it's also where we list upcoming webinars in addition to all of those webinar archive materials. So with that, I will now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Wafa Elamin. Wafa is a project manager here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started.
Thanks so much, Sam, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. A little bit of background about the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CETA. The Clean Energy States Alliance is a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations that are working together to advance clean energy. CETA works with state leaders, federal agencies, industry representatives, and other stakeholders to develop clean energy programs and inclusive renewable energy markets. CETA members, who are mostly state agencies, include many of the most innovative, successful, and influential public funders of clean energy initiatives in the country. Today's webinar is brought to you by the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative project, and this project assists states and other entities that have 100% clean energy goals or are considering adopting such goals by providing knowledge sharing activities and analysis so that they can address program challenges and opportunities. The 100% Clean Energy Collaborative is managed by CETA in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance. Feel free to check out our website to learn more about the collaborative, to see a table of the 100% clean energy states, maps and timelines, publications related to 100% clean energy, and upcoming and archived webinars. And there's a lot other resources that you can find on there as well. We've got two great speakers joining us today to share on the topic. We've got Subin DeVar, who's the director and co-founder of the Initiative for Energy Justice. Subin is the director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is a national research center that provides law and policy resources to advocates and policymakers to advance state-level transitions to equitable renewable energy. Prior to working at IEJ, he directed the Sustainable Economies Law Center's Community Renewable Energy Program to promote a just and rapid transition to clean energy through community governments of energy resources. Subin began his career working in the field of nonprofit communications. He first worked for the Tahiri Justice Center, a legal advocacy organization for immigrant women fleeing violence, and then M&R Strategic Services, a consulting firm serving nonprofit organizations. He holds a BA and BBA from the University of Texas at Austin and received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. We've also got Mariel Thuraisingham joining us from Frontend Centered. Mariel is a clean energy policy lead and she's an environmental law and policy specialist leading Frontend Centered's commitment to advancing the clean energy interests of frontline communities in Washington state that are historically disproportionately harmed by climate change. After completing her law degree, she worked on a rule of law promotion in Central America, Central and Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and West Africa, where she observed how lasting reforms were all rooted in community-led initiatives supported by institutions and infrastructure. In Washington, Mariel works to advance progressive policies to the center climate justice in the legal and regulatory framework through coalition building, outreach, and advocacy. Thank you so much for being here with us today. and I'm going to pass it over to Subin from IEJ.
Great. Thank you so much, Wafa. And again, my name is Subin DeVar with the Initiative for Energy Justice. And I'll be providing an introduction and overview of two reports we've recently released, the Justice in 100 Scorecard and Justice in 100 Metrics. But really, I'm going to focus on the scorecard. It'll just be a little teaser about the Justice in 100 Metrics report at the very end, mostly just so you know that it exists. But I'm going to focus on the scorecard at a high level, share what went into its development and its methodology, and then I'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of how one can use the scorecard. Just as a little warning, I'm going to go fast with some background and then really pause to go slow with the heart of the scorecard. And then again, as I mentioned, a bit quickly through some of the mechanics of the scorecard and the metrics. My hope here is that you'll walk away with understanding the methodology and principles that really underline this work. But I want to start off by talking about what energy justice is, or energy equity, and we use these terms interchangeably. One way I often talk about energy justice or energy equity is to explain it in two parts: who benefits from the energy system and how much people benefit from the energy system. Another way to put it is that energy equity is the just distribution of the holistic benefits and burdens of the energy system, including non-energy benefits such as economic and health benefits. It particularly focuses on remediating the harms of the existing pollution-heavy energy system, centering frontline communities and vulnerable populations. We see energy justice as connected to the long history of the environmental justice movement that grew into the climate justice movement, that has led a understanding of the framework of just transition, and that energy justice is a part and connected to all of that, but particularly focuses on the energy sector and the range from the minimum effort to alleviate energy poverty and just give access to energy, all the way to really transformative change in the energy system in advancing energy democracy. So the Justice in 100 project overall has these two reports that I've mentioned, and it's just one of a few of the areas that the Initiative for Energy Justice is working on to develop research and resource materials to support advocates and policymakers in centering equity. And I think the space of 100% clean energy laws gives a good example of equity in all the other contexts that we work as well too. In particular, the Justice in 100 scorecard is focused on how the transition, particularly in the electric sector in various states, to 100% clean energy, or in some states, a higher percentage of renewable energy, how that actually looks in practice in terms of whether there's an equitable beginning, middle, and end to that whole process. It requires intentional policy, data, and metrics to ensure that equity is really a part of these transitions. And this scorecard is focused on developing a way to evaluate legislative efforts in different states to set these commitments to 100% clean energy. A little bit more about the goals of this scorecard. The first goal, and it's really the first phase of this project, which is connected to the rubric that we've published so far, was to develop this scorecard for states and territories that have made 100% clean energy commitments. And mostly that's to support both practitioners and policymakers, advocates and practitioners who are working to pass laws in other states, as well as working in states that have passed laws to improve them, to constantly make them more equitable. The second phase of our work is going to be to take the rubric that we've created and actually apply it to 10 different jurisdictions that, as of 2020, Sierra Club had listed as having set some form of 100% clean energy commitment. And we know there's more than 10 jurisdictions that have set such goals, both at that time and later, but we're starting with this list. And just to clarify, as I mentioned before, the scorecard is intended to score laws that I've passed rather than the implementation of all of those efforts. But what I particularly want to point out in our time together today is that the content of our scorecard can really be thought of as informing both legislative efforts and regulatory efforts, because there's not always a clear-cut line of what's ended at the legislative effort. A lot of the details of clean energy policies are developed at the agency or regulatory level. And so we hope that it will still be valuable for folks in the implementation. Quick little background, after the Initiative for Energy Justice was founded in 2018, we kicked off with a workshop that brought stakeholders from around the country to help ground us in some of the key issues of energy equity, justice, and energy democracy, and started off with an initial publication called the Energy Justice Workbook, which included this one-page scorecard that I'll go into a bit more today. That's the underlying framework for the Justice in 100 scorecard that we've produced in 2021. So just as a little preview, I wanted to provide some context, and while I'm going to be talking about these pieces really briefly, I'm hoping folks go to the longer materials to really understand the core of our work. And as I noted, now that we've put out the rubric, we're aiming by the fall to finish scoring 10 jurisdictions. So a little bit more about the framework overall that underlies the Justice in 100 framework. We started off with this rubric, again, based on this one-page scorecard that we developed in the Energy Justice Workbook. And that workbook talks much more about just laying the groundwork of what is energy justice and setting definitions, both from scholarship as well as the work of grassroots organizers and advocates in this space over the years, and really distilling the robust field of justice, equity, and energy, and coming to some conclusions of some similar themes and principles. And ultimately, we land on 3 types of justice as being the core of driving analysis of what is policy that is energy justice, and what does a scorecard look like. And that's restorative justice, procedural justice, and distributive justice. I'm not going to go into those in particular, but just in brief, restorative justice has a key component of ensuring that there's a recognition of past harms. Procedural justice has a lot to do with process and communities being at the heart of decision making and designing the changes to the energy system. And then distributive or substantive justice includes areas such as ensuring that there's accessible, affordable, and democratically managed energy system, as well as ensuring the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. So we took that 3 types of justice and built out this energy justice scorecard, went from those 3 types to 5 points, 5 questions that we ask in this energy justice scorecard. And this is the one-page version that we put out in 2020 that we've expanded upon for the Justice in 100 scorecard. And these are the 5 questions. So I want to pause on this slide because I think it really gets to the heart of our work. So process asks, have marginalized communities participated meaningfully in the policymaking process with sufficient support? So the first question we ask, and the scorecard evaluates this on a scale of 1, which is no, to 5, which is yes, and then scores in between. For restoration, we ask, does the policy aim to remedy prior and present harms faced by communities negatively impacted by the energy system? And then there are 3 areas that all fall within that category of distributive or substantive justice. So we ask 3 questions here. There's sort of 3 levels of how deep you could go into distributive or substantive justice. At the most transformative level is decision-making. Does the policy center the decision-making in marginalized communities in implementation? Benefits, does the policy center economic, social, and health benefits for marginalized communities? And it is a basic core, access. Does the policy make energy more accessible and affordable to marginalized communities? We took that concept in that workbook and our initial one-page scorecard, and we started pulling in other work. We were particularly inspired by the comprehensive building blocks for a regenerative and just 100% policy document that was created by the 100% network and drafted by frontline community leaders. And we started with that tool and then brought in other sources to try to unpack the policy elements that really are key to ensuring equity in 100% clean energy policy. So we try to merge our one-page scorecard framework with all these various different tools and resources that were coming out of the environmental justice, climate justice, and energy democracy and energy justice movements. We used an advisory group process to bring stakeholders in from around the country to evaluate very early drafts of our rubric, iterate on those, get more information on how the rubric could be more useful both to practitioners as well as in agencies and for government officials that are thinking about evaluation and accountability. So we're really hoping for it to be a balance, a tool that could really provide communication and clarity and transparency for all the various actors and stakeholders in energy policymaking, particularly at the state level. And so here's where I want to pause and go slowly just for a little bit and point out that this document is about 40 or so pages long, and the question I'd love for folks to ask themselves if you're thinking about how this applies to you is, what do you need exactly based on where you are at, what organization or entity you work for, and what level of a process are you at? Do you need something simple and short, like 1 page? Do you need something that goes in a little bit more depth of about 5 pages, or do you need something that's even a reference tool of really specific information? We've designed the scorecard rubric with that 3-part structure in mind, and in some ways it's one document, but it's 3 tools. The scorecard, which is that 1 page, the worksheet, which is 5 pages, and guidance, which is about 20 pages, that really unpacks all of the elements that are in the worksheet. And how these fit together is that the 1-page scorecard, which I'll show a larger version of this in a second, essentially has those 5 questions that I listed in the very beginning. But to help you answer each of the 5 questions, there's 1 page in a worksheet that goes alongside answering that 1 question. And then ultimately the worksheet, which is driven by a point system, helps you get a short answer, a narrative answer, and a numerical score for answering each of the 5 questions. And the guidance section that is at the very end helps you fill out the worksheet. So it's, it all builds on each other. I'll go really quickly through an example of that so it makes a little bit more sense. Here again is the first part of this whole rubric. In some ways you could think of this as the beginning or the end. But if the end product is this 1-page scorecard, then the next piece of it is the worksheet, which is the 1-page document that goes along with each of the 5 questions that we pose in the 1-page scorecard. So here's an example of the second page of the worksheet that unpacks how to answer the question about restoration. And so I want to pause here and say, if you're looking for the middle level tool, the middle level of detail, these worksheets have a list in total, I think it's 46 different points, different policy elements that we're essentially asking, is this element in the state's law or not? And it's obviously not always easy to say yes or no. That is the system, the point system that we're using in the worksheet, but we're also in our own scoring imagining that there is the possibility of giving partial credit. And then to be able to answer these individual lines, for example, this one line of the worksheet that says ensures 100% transition off fossil fuels. If you're wondering, how do I answer that question? Then you turn to this section of the guidance and it unpacks it a little bit further for you to give you some explanation, footnotes to sources, to clarify a little bit more what we mean by ensures 100% transition of fossil fuels. So for this one, for example, it's about whether the law is really banning extractive energy system and combustible fossil fuels. So there are a lot of different points like this. I'm not going to be able to go into all of them in detail, but I just wanted to highlight one, for example. And at the end of completing filling out the points for each of those various elements for that page of the worksheet, you come up with the total number of points. And there isn't any set algorithm. What I want to say here is that while we try to balance objectivity and subjectivity in this complicated arena by creating this point system that provides at least some guidance, but ultimately there's not a rigid conversion mechanism. The points are to be combined with a narrative answer, particularly looking at any considerations that weren't a part of our worksheet to help you ultimately answer the part that you were under overall. So for example, here, if you had a score of 6 out of 13, and then if you had a narrative answer about other considerations to think about related to restoration and this question about remediation of harms, then you would summarize your answer and give a score from 1 to 5 for that question overall. Again, ranging from no, it doesn't remedy harms, or yes, it does, and possibly somewhere in between. So I also wanted to just flag, as I sort of mentioned already, that worksheet is meant to be a thought tool and not a calculator. And so there's just a few other ideas and ways that we think this could be used. It can help with the evaluation of legislation. It can help ask questions about these particular components. Is the criteria that's in that element of a worksheet, does it exist? If it does, is it done well? What does well really mean? That's where you may want to look at the guidance. The worksheet and the scorecard overall, we hope will help identify areas of improvement for one jurisdiction or replication of something in another area, and comparison between laws. But ultimately, obviously, it's really difficult to make one tool, one scorecard for all states and territories. And so we really hope that it drives conversation about what is at the heart of these policies. What are the core issues that are important for equity, and having conversations around that. Finally, related to the scorecard, I just want to share a little bit about our timeline. We're in the midst of working on draft scoring for the 10 jurisdictions, as I talked about. We're wrapping up a process of our near final draft scores, and then we'll open that up for feedback. And so if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to us. I'll provide our contact information at the end. And then we hope to publish the scores for those jurisdictions at the end. I think the last thing I'll say, though, is that really our hope in sharing the methodology of this is that that folks really grapple with what's in the rubric, and we hope the scoring helps. But really, a lot of more work went into the rubric that really I think could be useful, and people can adapt in their own ways. So I want to end by saying a little bit about this other companion report, the Justice in 100 Metrics. There's sort of two parts of it I want to really briefly touch on, just to pique your interest, and hopefully you'll check it out yourself. So first, we set out this logic model of how metrics and equity indicators can be used in the implementation of 100% clean energy laws. And so we set out 4 categories overall of metrics, and in each we inventory from a number of different resources, utility actions that can help achieve ultimate indicators of equity. So you'll see some examples of that here. And these equity metrics are particularly important in some of the pieces of what we look at in equity framework for 100% implementation, particularly the accountability mechanisms and the reporting that's necessary. But we see those as just 2 parts of a continuing cycle that has to start with restorative justice and clear goals and intentions and centering the right parties, and meaningful participation. And only that can be combined with data and reporting and accountability, and really, be a part of an iterative process, because obviously this will take years and decades to make the transition. And so we really see that as an ongoing process. And lastly, again, our website here is iejUSA.org, where you're able to find these resources and also contact us if you're interested in learning more or being engaged in our efforts any further. And thank you all.
Great, thank you so much, Subin, for that wonderful presentation. I think we're going to switch over to Mariel to go over her portion, and then at the very end, feel free to drop in questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll be able to go over those with both of our presenters and speakers for the last 15 minutes of our webinar.
Hello, everyone. Just to add on to the excellent intro, I work as the Clean Energy Policy Lead with Frontend Centered. And Frontend Centered is a coalition of over 75 organizations led by and serving the interests of communities of color in Washington. And the coalition was built around a climate justice goal. So although our coalition members serve many different communities and diverse interests and have many different types of missions, coming together within the coalition, we are oriented towards kind of climate justice and ensuring that the voices of frontline communities, communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, low-income communities are centered in policy decisions in the environmental and climate action space. And in Washington, we also have a governor and a legislature that openly put climate as a priority. So there have been important policies that have been generating in discussion and that have come out in recent legislative sessions, and the Clean Energy Transformation Act kind of being a big one of those that we participated in. The wording of has been now gone through primary rulemaking and is looking at implementation. It was passed in March 2019, signed into law that year, and the rulemaking kind of defined within the investor-owned utility sphere by the Utilities and Transportation Commission how the three primary electricity providing IOUs in Washington will have to comply with the law, and they serve almost half of the population of Washingtonians, and the other half are serviced by consumer-owned utilities and COUs. All of the utilities are held to the same kind of standards for reaching the 100% clean target, and it's just how they get there and how compliance looks, particularly around some of the equity mandates and energy assistance mandates that the regulators weigh in on. Actually, could you move to the next slide? As I build out some background, just the overview is that I'll be discussing our experience with CETA and what CETA is, lessons learned in passing and implementing 100% clean, where equity appears in CETA, and how the metrics are shaping out. A lot of that is being defined now. As we're in implementation, utilities basically define how their compliance with the equity mandate will be measured. So next slide, please. Some distinguishing characteristics of CETA are that it's a three-part target, a three-schedule target to be coal-free in the next few years, greenhouse gas neutral by 2030, and 100% clean by 2045. Utilities are required to submit clean energy implementation plans every 4 years, defining how they're, and after this initial one, future clean energy implementation plans and reporting will set additional kind of targets and actions, and how well those have been hit. Part of that includes, well, it covers everything from and touches on energy assistance as well. And through the legislative and rulemaking process, we were able to participate as a stakeholder in just defining certain characteristics of the law and ensuring that there was a component that would look at equity more broadly than just the there's the important access and affordability component of it, but also where else is there where else are there benefits and opportunities that will be generated from a clean energy transition, and where are there burdens? So looking at benefits not just as everything good, but also considerations and reflections on where are there potential harms, maintenance of existing harms, and even exacerbation of those harms. And so really enforcing more of an equity lens framework in planning out a transition and setting up these respective plans and defined actions and targets. And so Washington is, as I said, half kind of in electricity, half IOU, half COU. The map here shows the breakdown between sort of rural and urban areas, where that's concentrated. These IOUs provide much of the electricity in some of the more urban concentration areas, and the COUs in rural spaces, and also in municipal providers for kind of Tacoma and Seattle. Hydroelectricity is extensive here, and much of the electricity provided through the COUs is already pretty clean, and then the IOUs still have some catching up to do to get totally off of coal and moving towards clean energy. And there's ongoing rulemaking now to ensure it's very clear what clean, like using clean energy and 100% clean means. And it's absolutely our interpretation that that is the provision of 100% clean energy to all classes of customers in the state of Washington. And workarounds in terms of the renewable energy credits and offset systems, we want to make sure that that is in line with kind of that interpretation for the electricity that is provided to and consumed by Washingtonians and Washington kind of industry is clean. Next slide, please. Well, some of our lessons learned are, well, emphasis on the importance of advocacy and partnerships, of advocacy partnerships and alliances, and in engagement of those groups by kind of regulators. It was and continues to be really critical for the equitable application of this law that I can communicate with kind of staff and commissioners at the Utilities Commission and at the Department of Commerce that the public comment periods are at least 30 days for most filings, and that there's just those channels of communication and respect are really important to ensure that we that the voices of kind of communities are being heard and that they're being integrated into the actual kind of interpretation of how this law needs to look. Otherwise, there were definitely spaces of confusion around what equity means and what an equitable distribution of benefits and reduction of burdens. And that's the language from CETA that it is kind of being channeled towards the development of equity indicators. Some confusion around what that means. And in sorting that out, having a process with broad public engagement has been really, really important, because otherwise, if it were held just in kind of the rooms of the regulators or entirely in the utility, in the power of utilities to define, then the outcome would not really align with kind of the interests, like the public interest and the interests of communities and frontline communities. So processes like common processes, participation opportunities, framing equity and climate goals together. And that is in the language of CETA, ensuring that all customers benefit from the equitable distribution of benefits and reduction of burdens in a clean energy transition. That those tie together is really critical, so that equity is not siloed, and that it is understood that this framework needs to be applied to everything in the transition, everything source to delivery, storage, and all sorts of decision makings at utility scale. So it's not solely about providing a few community projects and then saying we did pretty good to make some people's lives better, but really ensuring that that equity application is integrated into every step of the of transition planning. Some of utilities have a lot more to do for that than others, but all utilities have to commit to an equitable outcome, or striving for achieving equity and reducing the harms, burdens, and disparities that that exist for customers and for communities who are impacted by their decisions. And then the allocation of authority and responsibility for what is that. The one lesson is that just be made clear as possible in the legislation, and that communities and community groups and stakeholders for kind of consumer advocates, environmental groups and community stakeholders, and justice practitioners, that they be engaged, that we be brought into spaces where definitions are established for what making progress towards expanding energy assistance looks like, what a highly impacted community is, what a vulnerable population is, and then also ultimately what accountability looks like for how, like, whether this equitable distribution mandate has been reached. Next slide, please. Thanks. So how the law transforms clean energy. Clean Energy Transformation Act. Transformation is in the title for a reason. It really is about thinking not just how do we uphold the same system but make it look better, or kind of gold plate it a little bit, but really think about how there can be some fundamental improvements that move more towards a just transition outcome in terms of the sort of economic and service and social welfare side of the energy system. The energy assistance provisions allow for an expansion so that low-income communities, 200% of the poverty level, or 80% of local AMI receive, are eligible for assistance that meets energy assistance need, where the energy assistance need is everything over 6% energy burden. And so these expand energy assistance, and utilities are making progress, or are kind of sorting out how to demonstrate that they will ensure that that assistance is available. And this has become even more kind of crucial as we're looking at a in a COVID world, and a lot of the kind of harms that communities have experienced, public health and economic, and how the energy system can reconfigure to further support those in greatest need. But the equitable distribution of benefits piece is the trickier one, because there hasn't been that much of a strong regulatory or existing framework for what the benefit, what assessing benefits and burdens looks like. And so the language of equitable distribution of benefits in the law, that's kind of what we go to. You see some of the language there, and that is from which is extracted the different areas for defining kind of metrics of equity, or indicators of kind of moving towards a more equitable transition in the area, and naming vulnerable communities and highly impacted communities as the named communities or communities of concern in a more equitable transition. That is, like, that in the law is critical, but understanding who those communities are and what utilities have to do about it, how they have to know their customers and those in their service area and those who are touched or impacted by their decisions elsewhere. That is, like, that part of the process in planning, data assessments, that needs to be defined in the law as well. And it is to an extent, but the rulemaking provides more opportunity for going further to really setting those standards for ensuring that utilities all kind of have that recognition, that extra recognition of what their customers look like, and why the equity lens isn't just keep prices super low and don't really think, don't give any further thought to, you know, income distribution or other needs. So in addition to just affordability, although affordability has kind of a lot of complexities too, this mandate really requires stepping further back and having that benefits, burdens, impacts, outcomes, costs, risks analysis in the kind of transition planning. I have an image here of the energy equity flywheel that a data analyst kind of put together for all the different type of work and how everything ties together. That's one iterative process. Next slide, please. I have also the framework that Subin and his team helped develop that we have applied to our advocacy in the rulemaking. How to really think about restorative justice, meaningful participation, adequate reporting, and accountability mechanisms at every stage of kind of what utilities need to do to show that they are moving towards 100%, and kind of the role, responsibility, and the power distribution for kind of the regulators and other entities, other concerned kind of entities and stakeholders in making sure that we actually kind of move towards the purpose of CETA. I also have some images here of another sort of framework for breaking down step-by-step applying that equity lens to the breadth of utility planning and decision making. Just thinking, like, what are you doing? What do you need to do? Who is impacted? Like, how are they impacted? And what can be done to keep the risks and the costs and the harmful and adverse impacts down, and the benefits, kind of economic, health, and otherwise, to keep those up, and to make sure that they are primarily, first and foremost, and primarily directed to communities who are suffering, have the highest concentrations of adverse impacts and benefits and burdens, usually frontline communities. Next, please. And so I've kind of touched on this already. How do you think about equity and their application of data and analysis tools? The Environmental Health and Disparities Map in Washington is a really important tool. It's named as a cumulative impact analysis in CETA, and it's required that utilities use the map to identify highly impacted communities in their service territories, in their and I'm kind of advocating for more of a sphere of influence assessment, so that, you know, from point of sourcing, generation, storage, transmission, everywhere where they're siting and facilities, that there's analysis that extends to communities impacted by where utilities buy and how that. But defined in the law is more the all customers benefit. So that is, I think, how utilities are primarily looking at where they do their data analysis on who is impacted and how. And then these other kind of assessments and setting big picture targets, or big picture, having a big picture goal for reducing burdens and distributing benefits, and then setting some specific targets along the way. Next slide, please. And so coming up with the indicators is entirely, like in Washington, it's entirely up to the utilities to come up with indicators. The IOUs are given, oh, next slide, actually, it's easier if I point to that. The IOUs are given some guidance in the rules, or they have to define them within certain elements that are extracted from the language of CETA. And the COUs are kind of more broadly kind of required to provide some indicators for their progress in energy equity in the transition. And next, please. I'm just going to grab another minute to look at, on the left, you'll see the categories for the customer benefit indicators, which are how the Utilities Commission has kind of defined the metric types that, or the areas for choosing metrics that utilities, that IOUs have to take on, taken from the language of CETA. And then I listed a few on the right that a couple utilities have proposed in some of their draft lists shared with stakeholders in the processes with kind of stakeholder meetings and equity advisory groups, which IOUs are required to form under the utility rules. And I'm in one of the groups for one of the big IOUs in Washington. And these are there because there's a lot of qualitative, like, consideration around what qualitative metrics will look like, and how those can be kind of prioritized and how those can be measured. Utilities are concerned, obviously, with setting targets they can reach and meet, and then we are concerned, of course, with kind of prioritizing the types of actions, like the types of measurements and then the associated types of actions that will bring the maximum benefits to those in greatest need, and reduce kind of burdens in a definitive way. But I thought these are just interesting because a lot of it's just going to come out of the discussion process and kind of, let's try this, like, how do we measure this, and then input from EAGs and from community consultations and consultations with community groups. But a lot of that is, most of that is enforced by UTC rules, and then internally within utilities, how far they want to go with kind of setting themselves up or establishing indicators for tracking equity. Last slide, please. Or how many more is there? Okay, so in working towards clean energy in Washington, we just want to make sure that there is understanding, that there is kind of agreed upon kind of understanding of the importance of constant learning in the areas of equity, and that learning may include amendments, like redoing rules, like amendments to CETA itself, changing things up in terms of how the clean energy implementation plans lay out indicators and metrics tracking and specific actions, and kind of coming back to like who are the named communities, who's impacted and how and why. But that needs to be ongoing. It's definitely not fixed at the point of passing the law or at the point of passing of the first rules. The advocacy is a big part of this, and advocate voices are really critical to coming out with more justice-oriented outcomes, and outreach and engagement are how you get there. Cannot figure these things out in back rooms or in the typical kind of boardroom spaces for kind of utility decision making, or even a lot of the regulatory process, which hasn't been accessible historically in most jurisdictions. I could wrap that up here and look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mariel and Subin, for the great presentations. We've got some questions who've come in from the audience. So Subin, a question for you. It says somebody had said that this scorecard seems very state-focused. Can it also be applied to cities who have similar goals, or is it more so on a state legislative level?
So yeah, the scorecard had to have a point of reference to start, and we picked the state level as the level of jurisdiction because we felt it would be both useful but then adaptable. You could look at it and then try to adapt it to a local context, and you could actually look at it and adapt it to a federal context. So been in conversations where folks are thinking about it that way as well too. And the main areas in which you probably have to adapt it is the different the balance of power is different at the state level versus at a municipal level. And are we talking about a municipality that has its own utility, or a municipality that has some jurisdiction that overlaps with some utilities? And so I think for the most part, the overarching one-page scorecard we hope is applicable to any level of jurisdiction. And then the worksheet, I think if you go point by point through it, a lot of those items would still be within the jurisdiction of some local decision making. You just probably have to adapt it a little bit to take some things out that just may not be within the scope of what decisions can be made at a municipal level.
Great, thank you so much. Another question kind of similar to, or building off of that, is IEJ considering expanding the scorecard and metrics work beyond the electricity sector to much larger, less regulated, and less progressive natural gas and oil world, or is it kind of all comprehensive?
It's a great question. We actually have at least one line or a couple lines in the scorecard that ask whether the law for that jurisdiction or the set of laws that are mandating a 100% clean energy transition, do they focus solely on the electric sector, or do they also look at the transportation, buildings, and industry sector? We, for the purposes of trying to create something that was usable in the short term, notice that most states have focused on the electric sector, but there's a variety of states that have also thought about these other avenues. And so we tried to balance that in this scorecard to try to draw attention to a state that has thought about this more holistically should ultimately score better in how equitable their 100% policy is, because those other areas are really important to a state's transition to 100% clean energy. It's not really just the electric sector that needs to transition. So for now, I think this is the level. We'll probably stay in this realm. There's ways in which we might expand it, but I think that would probably be thinking about how would it be adapted to implementation. How could there be a next step to suggest examples of good rules in different states? And those are some of the areas that we're thinking about continuing this work.
Wonderful, thank you. Mariel, there's a lot of interest around CETA and applying and the application of it and the process of working with Frontend Centered and frontline communities. You know, some people would like to hear more about how do you engage marginalized communities in a meaningful way, or how was that done through CETA or the development of that legislation and the work of the coalition at Frontend Centered?
CETA didn't. Frontend Centered was involved in CETA development, but there wasn't that much of a kind of public engagement kind of process, and so we've definitely made more of an effort to try to bring community voices into kind of the rulemaking, and now sort of the opportunities for participation with the equity advisory groups that at least the IOUs have to put together, and some COUs have kind of initiated themselves. I think it is well, I know it's always a missed opportunity to bring in more voices. There was kind of space created in the law for public participation in giving feedback on the plans, the clean energy implementation plans that utilities have to kind of pull together, and even in their in their purchase of electricity kind of arrangements. So there's kind of the designated time for public comment and participation, and the requirement that that those comments be considered, and a write-up about what that means. It isn't enough, obviously, just for utilities to check a box and say we consider that comment, but decided to do something else anyway. But any sort of record sets space for the commission later upon having the opportunity to approve a plan or not, to say, hold up, maybe there wasn't enough thoughtfulness or consideration if there was a significant amount of comments or public concerns expressed with an area of the plan that utilities just didn't account for, didn't adjust for. And engaging marginalized communities in some of the technical aspects of well, even kind of the technical to and the technical is not so technical. Oh, like, don't bother bringing communities to it. There's always some degree of understanding and some tie to the interests of communities, even if as you go deeper into kind of formulas and load calculations and revenue versus rate making and all of that. And that needs to be more understandable and better done. And what hasn't happened, and I'd like to see more of, is appropriate translation and interpretation, and that happening in clear language, in language that is more accessible, whether in English or Spanish, which is the second most widely spoken language in Washington, or a number of the other languages that many communities have as a first and sometimes only language spoken at home. So translation and interpretation of materials, but also consideration around education from, I think, regulatory bodies who have a handle on what those standards should be, but where the utilities have the resources and the time to also set up those opportunities, and they do, especially kind of the IOUs and the bigger utilities. They want to look like they're doing well around public engagement and community engagement, and they do have kind of resources to put towards it. And kind of there's more creativity in that space, thoughtfulness around kind of time and type of program, and provision in like a program that is kind of educational and in a language spoken in a community. So it doesn't have to always pass through kind of interpreters, but if it could be kind of primarily provided in those languages, those would be like those types of events, like would, I think, would be it just engaging on a different level, and always with an orientation towards education about how the system should work for people, but not trying to sell folks something or sell folks on perpetuating some of the more harmful practices, including some of the more harmful fuel types, as viable resources or as clean when they're not really. So yeah, there's a lot that can and should be done, and I hope that everyone will continue to try different things, reach out to me, reach out to community organizations, especially environmental justice practitioners for setting up partnerships and just educational exchanges, and yep, thank you for caring about all of that.
Great, thank you. And I have another question around the topic of CETA. Somebody would like to know what you think are the biggest missing pieces in CETA, and which of the existing elements will be the hardest to implement successfully, either on an implementation level or within the community level as well.
So I think right now I am thinking about the equitable distribution of benefits and reduction of burdens piece. And something that has become more clear that it's missing is maybe some more definition around that, and around the sphere in which benefits and burdens should be assessed and analyzed. There's not an explicit requirement for an assessment of benefits and burdens beyond kind of necessarily the customer range, or how that assessment should look. And I think it didn't really come through in the rulemaking either. And it would, if that happened earlier on, and had that, and was more clearly about the universe of equity, like the universe of equity considerations, and not just kind of looking, because a lot of utilities have interpreted it as maybe we have some energy assistance obligations and that's it. And so there's been much back and forth around how far that should reach. And so I think if that had come in early on, and there's a lot of I could refer to you some other kind of organizations that we work with who like to poke holes at CETA, even as we really try to get it implemented as equitably and also as kind of expansively with a public interest and environmental interest orientation as possible. I hope that's part of an answer, at least.
That's very helpful. So this question is, I think both of you might be able to provide a take on this. How would you recommend a state commission take on environmental justice without the existence of the laws and the frameworks that states like Washington State already have?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's a great question, and for almost every state that I'm aware of, most state commissions already have the jurisdiction to do what's reasonable and necessary to manage the electric sector and the utilities, which are a public service, and to ensure fair and reasonable structure of that system. And so I think to initiate their own efforts to jumping on what Mariel just was talking about, we'll start with an assessment of where are we? And I think what that requires is understanding the two pieces that I started about energy equity, of who benefits and how people benefit. It's totally within each state's state regulatory, the commission's jurisdiction to do an analysis of customers and who is benefiting, and do an analysis, cumulative mapping tools to just understand disparities. And to do a lot of the process and communication that Mariel also spoke of. So there's a lot of possibility, I think, in that assessment and in that listening to evaluate who's actually currently benefiting or not from the system. Because it doesn't necessarily require new legislation to really make a lot of improvements that the commission. So I think you could look at our scorecard really and just take a pen to it and really look down through that list and the process list, for example, look in the guidance, like what's stopping us from doing X, Y, Z, all of these things. You know, most of it is all really within, particularly the process side is within a commission's jurisdiction.
What Subin said, everything he said, absolutely. I mean, Washington did pass the Healthy Environment for All Act this last session. Environmental justice, the council is being formed now. Certain key agencies are required to have their own teams and actions, including an EJ analysis of agency act programs, and also allocation of budget to highly impacted communities. I think more of that, what we're seeing, and right now it's just being implemented, but what we're seeing is that agencies that already had champions for environmental justice are so far ahead of the pack. They're easier for us to help support. They have communication networks with communities, including grantees, like former currents, those who weren't issued grants but who had kind of initiated communications in order to kind of be considered. And there's some of that flow already, and there's definitely a determined like interest in doing more and doing better. And it's hard to say like do that, make sure people really care about this, but it's when people really care that that everything happens, especially when it comes more from kind of within the agency's leadership, perhaps than from direction from the legislature. But if all of that happens, it's better.
Great. And I know we're a little bit past the hour, so I just want to ask you both if you have any final takeaways that you'd like the audience to kind of walk away from this webinar with. You shared some really wonderful information about the scorecard and working with frontline communities and implementing clean energy policies. So I'd love to hear if you have any final takeaways that you'd like to leave the audience with.
I'd just say that I think there's this scary feeling of of areas that are new, and I think I want to encourage people to not feel like that energy justice or equity is too subjective, that it can't be quantified, that there's no objective aspect to it, that it can't be learned, and that I hope our tools and the conversations just further an understanding of, just take it step by step, understand some of the key pieces. It'll I think be really meaningful, I think, for everyone involved to try their best to address these issues, to just provide better service for all the customers within your jurisdiction, whether you're a utility or regulator. So that's my final thought.
Yeah, do all of that, absolutely, and there's a lot of space for learning and maybe for making some mistakes, but just greater awareness. And part of that awareness is bringing in perspectives that aren't yours, that aren't kind of the standard. And I think that's part of the inclusivity, the kind of the participation mix, but doing that in a way that is not exploitative, and that isn't just sitting back and expecting everyone to just like to show up when you set meetings, or to like open the door and they will come because you formed an advisor group. And why doesn't everyone want to be on it? There's a lot of trust building, and in establishing like lasting and relationships, and the types that I think will be really critical for this to work, well, and equitably.
Great, thank you so much, Subin and Mariel, and for everyone who has attended. I'm going to pass it back to Sam to close us out.
Awesome, thank you. So before everyone leaves, I'd just like to let you know about a couple of webinars that we have coming up in August. We have one on August 19th. Researchers from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory will be talking about behind the meter solar plus storage market data and trends. And then on August 25th, we will have some guest speakers talking about the LA 100 study, lessons for state 100% clean energy planning. We have a few more in the works, so do stay tuned, and we hope that you can attend some of our future webinars. So thank you again, Subin and Mariel. Thank you, Wafa, and thank you everyone who attended today. We will see you next time.